What if I told you an empire didn't fall to foreign armies or famine, but to a single swing of an iron-tipped staff inside a quiet throne room where a father mistook love for treason and shattered 7 centuries with one blow? This is the night Russia held its breath, and if you're ready to walk those haunted halls with me, hit subscribe now, because the truth behind Ivan the Terrible is not myth or rumor. It is a slow-burning fuse that ends with a dynasty on the floor. Imagine the echo of boots, the soft rasp of metal across stone, the breath of a man who has outlived every voice that once calmed him. November 1581 waits like a locked door while we step back in time. Because this murder did not begin with a staff, it began with a promise, a coronation, and a boy who learned that power can look like protection until the day it turns and devours its own. In 1547, Moscow crowned a 16-year-old whose mind was sharper than the winter air and whose memory held grudges like iron. He spoke of justice, wrote of order, and listened to peasants in smoky chambers, while foreign envoys wrote home astonished that Russia had found a ruler of rare discipline. A golden boy who seemed to rise from ash to architecture, from orphaned fear to orchestrated reform. He drafted laws that dared to weigh noble and commoner on the same scale, pulled corrupt officials into daylight, and crisscrossed petitions with notes in his own hand. The people adored him, the clergy blessed him, and Europe skeptical. Calculating Europe leaned closer because beneath the furs and icons stood a prince who believed fairness could be forged like a sword, tempered precise and made to cut both ways. But brilliance rarely grows without a shadow. As a child, he watched boyars brawl through corridors while he hid behind pillars counting his heartbeats and learning that mercy is a language men don't speak during succession crises. He fed half-wild dogs in the courtyard and later remembered their loyalty when men failed him, vowing that one day no one would make him feel small again. Then came Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle harbor after years of storms, the one presence that cooled his rage like snow on embers. When she died in 1560, official whispers said, "Illness but grief turned the Tsar into a cartographer of paranoia, mapping enemies in every shadow, tasting food with silver, and sleeping in a different room each night, as if betrayal couldn't learn the floor plan." He began keeping ledgers of resentment names written with a steadier hand than any love letter, and discovered a strange kind of entertainment in the theater of punishment. Ministers learned to craft sentences like prayers. Courtiers learned to make their fear invisible, and the ruler who once weighed justice now weighed screams, counting them like proof that order had been restored. In 1565, he unveiled the Oprichniki black-clad riders with brooms to sweep treason, and dogheads to scent it, an elite fraternity of grievance and ambition. They rode at night, knocked like thunder, and left houses bare as bones by dawn, a parallel country answerable to a single will, their salaries paid in land, and the soft currency of permission to be cruel. Novgorod felt their hooves before it heard their charges. For weeks, the bells tolled and the markets emptied while suspicion became a blade that needed no sharpening. Ivan set pavilions to watch confessions bloom under pressure, convinced that a city might be loyal only after it learned the taste of fear. And in that lesson, Russia discovered a new arithmetic: loyalty equals silence minus hope. Yet, even then, a counterpoint lived under the same roof. Crown Prince Ivan Ivanovich, 27, battle-tested, measured in speech and quick in mercy. He rerouted ruin where he could padded the fall of families marked by his father's pen, and believed that a future could still be built from law, not terror-proof. Perhaps that the son remembered the golden boy, the father no longer could. But paranoia is a jealous tutor whispering that every kindness is conspiracy, and every question is treason. The Tsar began to suspect even his heir reading concern as rebellion, mistaking filial duty for hidden daggers, and where the boy once saw his father as a monument of iron, he now saw a man crumbling under the weight of shadows he had cast himself. The court knew to lower their eyes when father and son argued, because Ivan's fury was quick to spill over like wine from a shattered chalice, and the courtiers had learned too often that spectators to rage became actors in their own executions. So when voices rose in the palace, they prayed only that the quarrel would remain words. The Livonian War pressed heavily against Russia's borders, draining coffers, sapping morale, and leaving fields barren of men. And in council chambers, the prince argued for reason. Treat prisoners with decency. Stop bleeding talent from the land. Look beyond vengeance. But to his father, such logic was treachery, wearing the mask of compassion. Meanwhile, the Oprichniki grew into a beast with its own appetite, sniffing out enemies whether or not they existed, and Ivan could not stop feeding it. He had built a weapon that no longer obeyed him, a black tide sweeping away the very foundations he once sought to fortify, while the prince quietly worked behind the scenes to save those caught in its current. It was a strange duet, the father tearing holes in the kingdom with suspicion, the son stitching them shut with secret mercy, and though they never said it aloud, each knew the other's handprints were everywhere. The dynasty had become a house with two architects, one designing with fire, the other with water. Rumors trickled through taverns and monasteries alike, whispers that the young prince would inherit, soon that perhaps with him would come the return of the early just days of Ivan's reign. Peasants blessed his name in the same breath they cursed his father's, and even generals leaned subtly toward his counsel, sensing stability in his measured tone. But hope is a dangerous perfume, and Ivan the Terrible could smell it everywhere. To him, those blessings were seeds of betrayal, those generals already sharpening blades, and the thought that his own flesh might eclipse him burned hotter than the embers of every execution pyre he had lit. By late 1581, tension thickened in the Kremlin like smoke. Small quarrels became storms. Polite corrections became accusations, and Ivan's eyes, once quick to brighten with ideas, now narrowed only with suspicion, watching his heir, as though the boy had already donned a usurper's crown. And then came the spark. A pregnant woman, the prince's wife, accused of dressing immodestly, her ankles showing beneath her gown. Ivan roared, the son defended, and what should have been a trivial domestic squabble became the final theater where love, paranoia, and dynasty collided. Courtiers' stiffened servants froze, and the echo of their argument rolled through the palace like thunder promising a storm. None dared intervene, for they had seen what happened when Ivan's staff became more than a walking stick. It became his verdict, his weapon, his signature written in iron. The argument blazed hotter, father thundering about honor and obedience, son standing his ground with the fierce devotion of a husband who refused to see his wife shamed. And in that clash of generations, the air itself seemed to tremble as though the Kremlin walls knew what history was about to record. Ivan's face darkened, his breath-ragged eyes feverish with the conviction that even love could be treason. The staff in his grip was no longer just a support for his weary body, but a scepter of absolute judgment, and those who watched from the shadows silently measured the inches between reason and murder. The prince pleaded with words shaped by compassion, arguing that a kingdom could not be held together by terror alone, that mercy was not weakness, but strength. And in those sentences lay the echo of the Ivan who once had listened to peasants with patience, a ghost that enraged the man who had long buried it. For Ivan the Terrible, such appeals were poison reminders of what he had lost, of what he could never again be. And he read them not as love for Russia, but as rebellion cloaked in civility, and paranoia struck its match against grief until the two became indistinguishable flames. Then came the blow, swift, merciless, unthinking. A staff tipped with iron driving into the temple of his own son. The sound a sickening crack that froze the court in silence, as though the earth itself had stopped to witness the moment an empire's future caved in. The prince collapsed, convulsing blood spreading like ink across the marble floor. And in that instant, the terrible mask fell away from Ivan, leaving only a father kneeling in horror, trembling hands pressing against a wound no prayer could close. "I have killed my son," he cried, voice echoing through vaulted ceilings. A confession and a lament that clawed at the hearts of those who dared to listen, and for the first time in decades, the Tsar's power offered him no refuge, no absolution. Servants scrambled, physicians rushed with trembling fingers and useless remedies, but the wound had already written its verdict. The prince lay pale, his breaths shallow, drifting further from the world as his father's sobs filled the palace, that had too long been filled only with the screams of others. For 3 days, the heir lingered silent and unconscious while Ivan haunted his bedside like a prisoner of his own crime, muttering prayers, bargaining with a God whose mercy he had long denied others, tears cutting grooves into a face hardened by decades of rage. On the 3rd day, the bells tolled not for victory or coronation, but for death. The prince was gone. The dynasty fractured, and the throne that had once gleamed with promise now stood as a monument to ruin its legacy, drowned in a father's grief and a nation's despair. News of the prince's death spread through Moscow like a winter wind, sharp and merciless, and the people who once whispered blessings for the heir now muttered laments in doorways and markets, sensing that with him had died the last fragile hope of deliverance from terror. Ivan wandered the corridors of his palace like a ghost, sometimes raging at shadows, sometimes weeping at his son's memory, his voice carrying through the stone like a broken hymn. Courtiers trembled more than ever, for grief made him unpredictable, and the line between sorrow and wrath dissolved with each passing hour. The image of him kneeling beside his son's body lingered in the minds of all who saw it. This man who had crushed nobles, cities, and armies, now undone by his own hand, his cries of, "I have killed my son," replayed like a curse that no amount of power could silence. Outside the palace, Russia itself quaked. Without a strong heir, the Rurik dynasty was brittle, and foreign eyes gleamed at the thought of a kingdom weakened by its own sovereign. A nation hollowed by paranoia and left to stumble headlong into chaos. Ivan, once a ruler of reform, had become the architect of collapse. His staff had struck more than his son. It had struck the spine of Russia, and in that fracture lay the seeds of famine, invasion, and civil war, the time of troubles waiting just beyond the horizon. Priests who once praised him now whispered of divine punishment, interpreting the blow as heaven's justice for the blood he had spilled. Even allies recoiled, for if a father could murder his heir, what safety was there for a boyar? A general or a priest standing too near his wrath. Alone at night, Ivan paced before icons, sometimes begging forgiveness, sometimes demanding it as though God were another subject to be commanded. But silence was all he received, and in that silence he discovered the same helplessness he had once inflicted on thousands. The Oprichniki, still hungry for power, continued their raids, but even they sensed the shift. Their master was unraveling, his terror less a weapon than a wound, and loyalty to a dying son began to flicker as ambition whispered of other orbits to follow. For the people, hope had become a memory. They remembered the young Ivan who once listened to their complaints and believed that man might rise again through his son, but now that dream lay in the earth, and all that remained was the shadow of a czar who had devoured his own legacy. And so the empire waited, not with expectation, but with dread, knowing that the last years of Ivan's reign would not bring redemption or reform, only the long echo of that fateful blow reverberating through villages and palaces alike, a prophecy of ruin already fulfilled. The Kremlin grew quieter in the months after the prince's death, not with peace but with fear so heavy that footsteps echoed like confessions. Courtiers spoke less, bowed lower, and learned that silence was the only shield left in a palace where grief stalked the halls like a predator. Ivan's rage did not vanish. It twisted inward, erupting in sudden fits of violence against servants or nobles who reminded him too much of his son's defiance, yet collapsing into sobs when confronted by reminders of what he had lost, a man swinging wildly between tyrant and broken father. Chroniclers described him as two men sharing one body, the monarch who still demanded absolute obedience, and the mourner who wandered his chambers at night, whispering his son's name as though repetition might raise the dead. Foreign envoys reported his decline with both dread and calculation. Some wrote of his wild eyes and trembling hands, others of his sudden bursts of lucidity, in which he recounted his victories, as though they might redeem his failures, and all recognized that the empire stood on a knife's edge. Meanwhile, the people beyond Moscow's walls felt the weight of absence. Famine gripped the countryside, taxes rose to fund wars that no longer made sense, and every rumor of the prince's kindness became sharper, more painful, because it reminded them of what Russia had lost. Priests urged Ivan to repent, but he was trapped in cycles of denial and despair, confessing one moment only to accuse heaven of betrayal the next. For a man who had built his life on dominance, submission to guilt was an impossible exile. Legends began to form even before his death. Tales of a Tsar haunted by visions of his murdered heir, of a ruler who awoke screaming in the night, swearing that the boy's eyes glared at him from the shadows of the icons. His courtiers, terrified of provoking his wrath, pretended not to hear his wails or see the tears that streaked his face. But behind closed doors they spoke in whispers of succession, of what would become of Russia when Ivan's own heart finally gave out. And give out it did, though not before years of torment. In 1584, the man who had built an empire and then shattered it sat across a chessboard from a courtier too afraid to win. His mind clouded his body, weakened his legacy, already a ruin written in blood. Witnesses claimed his last words were of his son, a final confession from a king who had discovered too late that power cannot shield a father from regret. And when Ivan the Terrible breathed his last, he left behind not triumph, but a kingdom cracked open, ready to bleed into chaos. The death of Ivan the Terrible did not close a chapter so much as rip it open for the throne he left behind. Was not an inheritance but a wound, and Russia stumbled into what history would call the time of troubles, a storm of famine, rebellion, and foreign invasion. Without Prince Ivan Ivanovich, the line of succession fractured. His younger son, Fyodor, was gentle, pious, and unprepared, a man more suited to the cloister than the crown, and though he wore the title of Tsar, real power slipped quickly into the hands of ambitious boyars circling like wolves. The dynasty that had once ruled for over 7 centuries now dangled by a thread, its authority hollowed out by the very man who had sworn to strengthen it. And in every village the people whispered that Russia was paying the price for the blood spilled in the throne room. Famine swept the land like a second army fields, barren bellies empty and faith fraying as peasants asked why God had abandoned them. Some said it was punishment for Ivan's sins, others that the devil himself had marked the dynasty, but all agreed the empire bled from within. Foreign powers saw opportunity in weakness. Polish and Lithuanian forces pressed at the borders. Mercenaries sold their swords to whichever claimant promised gold, and Moscow became a chessboard where kings, nobles, and impostors all tried to move the same shattered crown. Pretenders arose, men claiming to be Ivan's murdered son miraculously alive. Figures draped in mystery and lies who gained followers desperate for hope, and the irony was cruel. Russia, once unified by fear under Ivan, now fractured by false heirs conjured in his shadow. The Oprichniki, once instruments of terror, faded into irrelevance, their black robes discarded like the skin of a dead snake. Yet their legacy endured in the scarred memory of the people, a reminder that organized cruelty never truly dies. It only waits for another master. The church struggled to soothe the nation, but even holy words could not erase the echo of a father's scream. "I have killed my son." A phrase that seemed to haunt not just Ivan, but the land itself, as though Russia's soil had absorbed his guilt. Every winter night, as fires burned low and the wind scraped across the steppes, villagers told stories of the terrible Tsar who struck down his own blood, a cautionary tale for children, but also a wound too deep for adults to forget, turning history into folklore laced with fear. And so the legend hardened. Ivan the Terrible was no longer remembered for his early reforms, his victories, or his laws, but for the single act that destroyed his dynasty, proof that the most dangerous enemy of a kingdom can be the very man who rules it. The time of troubles deepened, stretching year after year like an open wound that refused to close, and Russia, once united under the iron hand of its Tsar, now fractured into rival factions, each claiming loyalty to a different vision of the crown. Villages were razed, harvests stolen, and rivers ran thick with desperation. Foreign mercenaries roamed the countryside, sometimes fighting for a claimant, sometimes for themselves, while peasants cowered in wooden huts, remembering the days when even Ivan's terror had felt like order compared to this chaos. In Moscow, the boyars maneuvered like chess pieces, each plotting alliances, betrayals, and marriages that might steady the crown, yet every move only deepened the fracture, for no one could erase the absence of the true heir whose blood had stained the marble floor of the Kremlin. Fyodor sat on the throne, but not in power. A hollow Tsar whose prayers rose higher than his decrees. He was a monarch in name but a shadow in practice, and Russia's enemies learned quickly that its bite no longer matched its bark. Pretenders multiplied, some claiming to be Dmitry Ivan's youngest son, thought to be dead, others inventing new royal bloodlines altogether. The people, starved of hope, followed them not out of conviction but desperation, clinging to the idea that someone, anyone, could lead them out of darkness. Battles raged not only on the borders but in the streets of Russian cities themselves. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, all while the memory of Ivan's fateful blow loomed like a curse whispered into every soldier's ear. The dynasty was broken, and so too was the nation. Foreign envoys reported back to their courts with astonishment that the mighty Russian bear, once feared for its claws, now stumbled drunkenly through its own den, wounded and bleeding, a prize waiting to be carved up by whichever predator struck first. Amid the turmoil, whispers grew into conviction that Ivan's sin had poisoned not just his family, but the land itself, that the soil rejected stability because it had tasted royal blood, and in that belief, Russia's suffering was reimagined as divine punishment. Yet through it all, stories of the young prince lived on tales of his mercy, his wisdom, his ability to balance strength with justice. For many, he became less a memory and more a symbol of what might have been a ghostly air haunting the conscience of the nation. And so the story of Ivan the Terrible closes not with his death, but with a legacy of ruin, a warning carved into history that the most terrifying tyrants do not always fall to armies or assassins. Sometimes they fall by their own hand, striking down not just their sons, but the future itself.